Good morning. Today's class is going to be on research. The next topic that we're going to study is about experimental research and exploratory research. Okay, so these are coming under the topic research methods. So experimental research is a type of research. Exploratory research is another type of research. So let us see what is an experimental research. So whenever you do any investigation, that is when you do not know an answer to a research question, you will investigate to find answer. Okay, so that is usually experimental research. So the study is a quantitative research. Like quantitative means you use, instead of description about a particular thing, you use numbers related to measurement of something. So that is experimental research. So there are three types. One is the pure experimental, then the non-experimental, or quasi-experimental, or semi-experimental. Okay, so these are all types of experimental research except the non-experimental. So experimental is pure experimental research. So actually that is the one which is part of your syllabus. So we have to see some examples which will help us to understand the differences, because explanation, more than explanation, the examples will help you. So for example, so in any thing in this society, there is a cause and there is a effect. The common example that we take usually is when we smoke cigarettes, it causes cancer. So that is there is a cause for cancer and the effect is cancer. So smoking is the cause of cancer, and what is the effect of smoking? You get cancer. So there is cause and effect relationship when we test it. That is usually an experimental research. For example, another example is whether you have understood what is being taught. How can a teacher assess whether a student understands? By asking questions or having tests. So if the student scores good mark, then one thing is the teacher would have taught well. Okay, so that is a cause and effect. Similarly, a person who has had an accident on the road, the police will come and check whether he is drunk. How do they check? They use a breath analyzer. They analyze the breathing. So if there is alcohol in the breath, then they know that because of drinking the person has had accident. So drinking causes road accident, and the intervention that we use is the breath analyzer. That is, we test a person's breathing or the breath, and if we find that there is alcohol smell in it, then we conclude that the cause of accident is drunken driving. Okay, so this is the cause and effect. So there is a cause for an effect. So this cause and effect relationship is very good, very important, and this is what we study in research. So the researcher either knows the cause or he knows the effect. So in the example of the accident, we don't go and check every person's breath thinking they are drunk. Only when there is an effect, that is when there is an accident, then we check the breath of the person. So usually when there is an effect, the person's as different aspects are studied. Okay, another way of saying it is, if a person gets cancer, then we go and check if the person has been a smoker. So based on the effect, we look at the cause of the effect. What has happened that has caused this effect? So once the effect happens, then only we learn and search for the cause. Okay, so when we see from the effect and then trace the cause, then it is not an experimental study. Okay, on the other hand, when we look at the cause and see the effects, then it's an experimental study. Okay, see, to put it in simple words, I'll just take one example and have both the things for you. If a person is a smoker, then if the person slowly gets cancer, so you know the cause and you're studying the effect. So you see whether a smoker gets cancer or any other disease. So based on the cause, you look at the effect, then it is an experimental study. Okay, the other thing is, or the opposite of it is, you look at the effect. If already in a hospital there are 10 patients with cancer, then you go on to find the cause of cancer. Okay, so from the effect you look at the cause. That is a non-experimental study. Okay, so we have know what is experimental study, what is non-experimental study. When you look at the cause and then search for the effect, it is experimental study. When you look at the effect and then find the cause, that is a non-experimental study. Okay, so in any of these experimental, non-experimental studies, there are variables. Okay, you should understand what is variable. There are independent variables. Independent variables means each of the factors which can cause the effect is called a variable. Like for example, age of a person. As the person becomes older, there is more risk of cancer. So then age becomes a variable. So that is one variable. Then the sex of the person, the education of the person, whether the person is working in a industry where there is a lot of pollution. So each of these are variables which can actually have an effect on the outcome or the effect. Okay, so all this has to be studied in the research. So you have to look at all these variables and how they affect the outcome of the research. So that is about the experimental research. Now we'll come to the semi-experimental research. The semi-experimental research is also known as quasi-experimental research. Okay, when you read a lot of journals, you will come across these words, semi-experimental or quasi-experimental. Okay, so this means it has got both experimental component and non-experimental component. Both of it is part of the study. So you do an experimental study. We already know experimental study is finding the effect from the cause. So we know the cause and we are looking at the effect. So that is experimental. So when we do the study in a controlled environment or a natural environment, okay, then we will be able to understand the effects. For example, if we are creating a controlled environment, like within a room you create a lot of smoke and you find out what is the effect of the persons breathing or living in that room with smoke, then you are doing it in a controlled environment. Okay, but it can also be done in the natural environment, so there is no intervention by the researcher. So when you control the environment, that is you are doing an intervention. So that is a semi-experimental study. Okay, so there are different types of experimental design, okay, that you have to understand. It's not very important, but it's just important that you know the names. The before and after experimental design, that is before how it was and after the intervention how it is. Okay, then the control group design. So there are two groups, one is the experimental group and the other is the control group. So you take two groups for the study. One is the group which has an intervention, so you do an intervention and you find out the result. The other group, you do not intervene at all, they go do the natural way and you compare both the groups. Okay, then the comparative design, matched control. What we told, the control group, sometimes it may be matched, so age, sex of the control group is matched with the age and sex of the experimental group, then it becomes a matched control group experimental design. Placebo means when you do an intervention with a substance which has no effect. For example, if you are trying to check whether metacin cures fever, okay, so in one group you are giving metacin for fever patients, the other group you are giving a tablet which is only a vitamin tablet or which has no effect. It is a piece of it has no effect. It could be chalk or something which has no effect at all on the human body. So You take two groups. One group you give the metacin, which is the intervention, and check whether the people have cured fever. The next group you give this tablet which has no effect on the human body, and then see if that also has cured. So that is a placebo. So one group where you give intervention which has no effect on the human body, that's called as the placebo. Okay, so these are all types of experimental design. So your study can be any of these types. Next we'll go to exploratory research. So what is an exploratory research? So exploratory research is when something you have no idea about, nobody knows the answer. Okay, for example, the present scenario of coronavirus, nobody knows what will cure it. So we are just exploring, we don't know anything, we are trying to find a new solution. Okay, it comes from the word explore. So when olden days people who went to a new part of the world where no one has visited, like Columbus, he came to India, Vasco da Gama, these people who visited different parts of the world. So they were exploring the world, they were doing things which no one has done previously, no one knew about it. So same way, when you do a research for which nobody has done research, nobody has an answer, then it is called exploratory research. So this cannot be done in a controlled environment, because you do not know, you don't know anything about the subject, and so it has to be, research has to be done in the natural setting. For example, coronavirus, if we are checking whether a particular drug is useful against coronavirus, then we have to give it to different people in their own setting. Okay, then we will know if it is really helpful against the disease. So that is what exploratory research is all about. So what is the purpose of exploratory research? So the exploratory research is mainly to investigate or do a research on a particular phenomenon. Okay, one particular aspect you take and then you do research, and you try to find the solution or answer. That is exploratory research. And usually you want to see the effect on different variables. So there are different independent and dependent variables. So the effect of dependent variables may not be known before the experiment begins. Okay, before you do research, you do not know how the dependent variable will have an effect on the research. So you include that variable and check whether it has any effect in your research. So that is part of the exploratory research. So both the independent and dependent variables are important in an exploratory research. So we'll see what are the types of data that are collected in a exploratory research. There are different types of data that you have collected. Mainly you collect data in the field, or sometimes the data is already there in the chart of the patient. So usually you collect data from the field, that is either in the community area or in the hospital inside the wards. So that is the field area, where field means does not mean only in the community, it means in the setting where the patient or where the research is taking place. So that is the field. So in exploratory research you collect a lot of data, because these data will be very important to check the relationship between the variables. See, if for example your patients are there is a new type of cancer, or let us take the example of coronavirus because it's going on in the current scenario. See, you take 100 people having coronavirus and you find that 50 of them die. So you want to know why these 50 people died. So what are the variables that you will check? You will check the age of the person, you will check the sex of the person, you will see if the person who has died has any comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes. Okay, then these are all known things. Then in your exploratory research you will check for unknown things. So what are the reasons why these 50 people died? Whether they have had any surgery in the past, whether there is any internal fixator, whether there is any cancer that has not been diagnosed yet. So these are all new things that you will check. In other people, we know that they have diabetes and hypertension by routine check. But when somebody has died, we go in detail. So all this data has to be collected. So there are a lot of variables, dependent variables and independent variables. So once all this data is collected, then you will explore to find whether there is any reason for the death of these 50 people alone, and the other 50 people do not have those conditions. So if you find something unique in these 50 people who have died, then we know that that is the cause of the death. See, among the people who survived, there may be people who had diabetes, people who had hypertension. So why did they survive? Why did these people die? So there must be some difference. Is it the older age? Older age is also one of the reasons, but there may be other reasons which we don't know yet. So that is what exploratory study is all about. You will be collecting data about all the aspects, different aspects of the people who died, and then you will compare it with the people who are living, and then you will come to a conclusion. So this is the type of data which is collected in exploratory research. Okay, so finally we'll see what type of experiments are usually done in exploratory research. What are the experiments? Okay, usually in non-health field, if you are not in a health field, for product effectiveness you will do mainly this kind of research. So the product effectiveness is, we do not know how the product will be effective, so we will check each of the different variables, like if there is a high temperature, whether the product works, if there is a high voltage, whether the product works. Okay, so we will check each of these variables, we'll manipulate the variables and then check if it works. For example, in human life, if you see in the same coronavirus example, if a person is doing research on trying to find the best medicine for coronavirus, then you will try to give that medicine for old people, for young people, for people without breathing difficulty, for people with breathing difficulty, for people who have diabetes, for people who have hypertension. So we are trying to use the effectiveness of the product, or that is effectiveness of this new medicine, by using it in people with varying variables. Okay, you understand? Simple. I'll repeat again. So you have a new medicine for coronavirus. Okay, so you are exploring to find out if the medicine is effective. So how do you explore it? You will give it to different groups of people. If you give it to healthy people without symptoms who have coronavirus, there are some coronavirus patients who are healthy, who have no symptoms. If you give the medicine only to those people and they become cured, then you cannot say my medicine is very effective, because they already were not having any symptoms. So you should use your medicine on people with different variables, that is different kinds of problems: breathing difficulty, ICU patients, old people, young people, people with hypertension, people with diabetes. All these people who have coronavirus, they should be given the medicine. And if it is effective in all the people, then only you can say your medicine is effective. Okay, so that is how we check for product effectiveness using exploratory research. Okay, so with that we finish the experimental research and exploratory research. The next class we will study about 3 more things. One is case study, then the cross-sectional study, and the longitudinal method of research. Okay, so these 3 we will see in the next class. Thank you.